Hi everyone, it's Vicky. I talk about mental models and clear thinking, clear communications on YouTube. And today I'm chatting with June. And so let's pass it to June first to let us know who she is and what we'll be talking about today.
Hi, I am a longtime print publication designer and editor. And lately, I've been working a lot on my own writing. So I'm working on a book and building out a presence on Twitter. And because I'm working on those things, I've been finding myself in a lot of rabbit holes, which is, I think, what we're talking about today, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we'll talk about how we even get into rabbit holes in the first place. So how do we get out of them? And maybe we can even talk about then how do we communicate what we've learned from those rabbit holes to other people who hasn't gone through the same experience. So curious why you are exploring this and which type of rabbit holes you're going down these days.
Well, there's so many rabbit holes. I feel like there's like a network of rabbit holes that if you like fall down one, suddenly you realize there's like a ton of other ones that you can fall down. So my book is about culture and storytelling. And I think originally I really wanted to focus on just what is it, what is culture? How do the stories that we tell each other contribute to that? And as I was writing, I it was impossible not to think about my own experiences of growing up with Taiwanese immigrants as parents in the United States. So I started to get pulled into like my own memories of what that was like and what culture means to me. So that was like kind of my first big rabbit hole, was like getting sucked back into memories,
Hmm.
which that one's a really hard rabbit hole to fall under because you're then grappling with, well, how much of this was true? How much did I just construct in my head? And then like, because none of us really wants to feel alone in our experiences, you'll like go Google, you know,
Is this normal?
yeah. And like, does everyone like question their own memory? Is this
Yeah,
like, this isn't just me, right?
yeah. Have you ever felt any, I guess, um, questions about how you should tell the story, tell your own story? Because I also started to write about my personal experiences, and I think this is also the word that you use, is at the intersection of cultures, of identities, of what's going on, and growing up as an immigrant family in Canada as well. There's so many times I think, but how do I tell this in a way that other people who may not have experienced this would get what I'm saying? And also for those people who have experienced a different version, but somewhat similar, how do I build that connection with them? So I find myself feeling a bit confused, almost talking to two audiences. And I know a lot of advice on writing is always, have one audience, one person that you're talking to. So I'm curious, have you thought about this? And if you have a solution to this, even if just one that you're testing, or what is it?
I think about this often. There's so much out there that encourages us to think about who our audience is going to be. And what I found people have really resonated with my writing over is like when I'm actually writing pieces that are meant to comfort myself. Like
Mm.
I wrote a piece about um, fear and kind of imagined that fear was this person who was sitting across from me having coffee in the morning because I was having coffee and I was feeling afraid. And I really just wrote it for me. But that was one of the pieces that was really popular. And when I say really popular, it was on Twitter, and like in the grand scheme of like the things that have been popular for me, it
Mm.
was one of the better ones. Um, And I think it's because we maybe really think that we are alone in this. We think our situation is so unique, that we can't anticipate how people are going to interact with it. And in some ways, it's been easier for me to just let go of that question of like, how is someone going to interact with this? Because um, I simply can't know, right? Like, I really don't know if my parents, who are Taiwanese, but they are specifically Hakka, which I don't know enough to explain that, except that they like spoke some kind of dialect that wasn't Taiwanese and it wasn't Mandarin. It was actually Hakka. So I grew up with like some weird combination of like Mandarin, Hakka, and Taiwanese.
Yep.
So like, I don't know if that sets them apart from other Taiwanese people. I don't know if like the fact that I grew up in Arizona is relevant to anything. So I've kind of like, that's almost like a rabbit hole that I tried to go down. And then I was like, this is too big of a rabbit hole for me to anticipate like how anybody else might intersect with my experience. And I wrote a piece recently about how I wasn't afforded a lot of privacy growing up, and that was a rule in our house that privacy was not like a right that we had. Um, to the point where like my parents didn't even really shut their doors. It was just like everyone's door was mostly open. Um, and other people resonated with like the unspoken rules of a household and the idea of like getting away into books. And um, there's like, the only place that I found privacy was in the bathroom. And like some people actually resonated with that aspect of it, having spent like a lot of time in the bathroom.
Yeah.
So we like, it's really hard to anticipate that. So I'm doing my very best to like try not to think too much about that and just be as specific as I can be about like my own experiences.
That's so interesting in the sense that kind of you provide what you know and then let other people decide which part resonate with them. And it could be different parts for different people, but then that's okay, right? It's just in general, if anyone sees something that they're curious about or resonates with them, they just hold on to it. That's really interesting. That makes it, I feel like that's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to write about stories if you can just let that go of, okay, I write what I know, and then you guys decide what happens with this, how you interpret it in a sense.
Yeah, that's at least what has worked for me and what it's like the only way I can keep writing. I feel like if I'm trying to think about how I'm going to actually like change someone else's life, it starts to feel too big.
Yeah.
Like I'm not the person for that. I just have like my story and I don't even have all of it, right? Like I try to think back and I just have like the biggest things that I remember in that moment, which is also a really interesting thing because like you realize that in falling into memories, they're not accessible all the time. Like sometimes you need like the right Google search to like spark the right memory, which is like a really fascinating part of like the rabbit holes that we don't fall into them until like the time is right in some way.
I never thought about the timing point of view. Any examples that you had outside of the going down your own memory, but searching other maybe storytelling techniques or stories of others when you do your culture piece on your book?
I mean, I think it would be hard to not talk about this without talking about the events of 2020. That so much of what happened in 2020, I think it really gave me permission to think more critically about my particular intersection and how that has impacted who I became, my outcomes in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
And it's impossible to know, but I do question if 2020 hadn't happened, if I would be digging into this at all, because a lot of what we inherited when it comes to culture wasn't talked about. And it wasn't like, I never thought I would be trying to ask these questions about like, how did the fact that my parents were Taiwanese immigrants affect how I grew up? Like it clearly had an effect because I wasn't the same as everyone else, and my parents did not have the same expectations as those parents who, like my friends around me. But I never really thought about it through the culture lens. And so, like, even just experiencing 2020, I think, and bringing a lot of light to kind of the structural components of our identity really is the biggest example of like external timing, at least. And then as far as like my own personal journey, because 2020 sort of like put my job on the back burner as something that would come back after the pandemic was like largely resolved. I found myself with a lot of time. And then I was like, well, I want to do something productive with this time, but also something really meaningful. And I think I really came to believe that there's a lot of power in just sharing individual stories, because without the individual stories, we can't ever find the patterns. Because there is so much nuance to what's happening to create who we become.
Were you scared to share your own stories? Were you ready to share your own stories?
No, I am not ready. There are many times where I post like the tiniest snippet because I'm not ready, because I'm like, let me just give you a peek, and please, like, internet, please don't hate me, is like what I'm thinking when I hit publish. I'm like, please just, like, I'd rather you guys all just ignore this than have someone like say one mean thing or like start to engage me in a dialogue that I'm not trying to have, right? Like this is and maybe that's a cop out in a lot of ways. I'm like, this is my personal story. Like there shouldn't be any place for you to argue with me.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Oh, okay.
But what about you? Like I know you've been exploring some intersections that are cultural in nature. Like I know you talked about language a little bit, and then also like sushi rolls. And I guess I'm curious, like, how has that felt for you to share those?
Um, it feels complicated. So I've been trying to talk about culture for a very long time without succeeding. And I actually started my YouTube channel wanting to talk about these intersections of identities, of cultures, of well, I'm Asian, so I wanted to first feature Asians who, spoke different languages or grew up somewhere else, having multiple identities. Because I felt like when I went, because in Canada, there's a really interesting phenomenon, at least in my bubble, that if I looked at anyone on the street, I don't know, it could be Asian, could be brown, could be black, could be whatever, I never assumed they were foreigners. I always thought that they just like another human being on the street. But then when I started to study abroad, then all of a sudden I realized like I am very different from other people. Like, they're surprised. Oh, you speak English. That's really amazing. And I thought, but there are so many of us who are Asian to speak English. Anyway, so that was kind of the origin of it. And I got really confused. I was trying to figure out what was happening. And then I think being politically correct really held me back because I didn't know what was right to talk, but like, how should I talk about these issues? So I don't know. I probably had a cop out as well, where I would feature other people's stories, but I wouldn't talk about mine. But then maybe for me it was 2020 as well, with like Black Lives Matter and all these upheaval, that I thought maybe I wanted to share my story. Also, it was because on YouTube I focus more on these practical, like how to do XYZ, than how these guys. And while I think it gave me the creative permission to a degree, I felt like anyone could talk about these elements and it wouldn't matter to the audience. Like, I'm just a vessel, deliver this message that many people can. So I thought, I don't know, what is something specific that I can talk about that only can come from me. So that's why I went on to Twitter and went on Ship 30 to try to figure out what story I can tell. And that's how I started. Every single time before I hit publish, I would be nervous. But also, if I don't receive enough attention on them, I feel very upset as well. I'm sharing my story, but maybe it's not resonating. But I know it should resonate with at least some people. So where are they? Are they reading this and they're thinking, no, that doesn't really make sense for me? And then that makes me really sad, I guess. So that's my experience, a very short experience with telling stories, especially at the intersection of cultures and identities and such.
It's so interesting to hear people talk about the moment they realize like this idea of culture and different cultures exists. Because for you felt like, I think that you were just amongst other humans, and then at a certain point in transitioning to studying abroad, you realized that there were a lot of other people that looked like you, and that their culture was very distinct from the one that you knew. And I had a very, very similar experience. When I was growing up in Arizona, I never really thought about anyone as having race. Like, I really just thought I was just like everybody else.
Right.
And then I went to UC Berkeley for college, and UC Berkeley, the majority of students are Asian, or they identify as Asian in some way. And that was a really hard first year. I went from presumably not belonging, right? Like, if you look from the outside, like one Asian girl amongst like many, many white people should have maybe felt separate, but I didn't. And then at UC Berkeley, I was like one Asian girl amongst many, many Asian people, and I felt so alone. Like, I really didn't resonate, and I didn't get along with them as well as I think I should have, or maybe I was expected to. Like, I became kind of lumped in because I looked like people, but I didn't feel like them. So I had a similar moment where, like, I also realized that growing up, I thought I was just, man, this is so hard right now. I feel like I'm about to toot my own horn, but like, I thought I was just attractive and that's why people looked at me. But now, like, because I went to UC Berkeley, I was like, oh, maybe they were looking at me because I was Asian. Like, it did not even occur to me to think that it was like just something I couldn't change. Yeah, so that moment where we go from like standing out in one way but feeling like we belong, to standing out in a different way and then not feeling like we belong in some ways, like, that feels pretty universal, actually. Like that we all have that moment where we realize that there's something about how you look and where you come from that is significant to a lot of people.
Yeah, it's so true. And and also on the flip side of, I think at moments of my life where I felt the other way of, then I look like this, but I want to fit into a different group. Maybe, for example, at work, I was in management consulting, so it was a very like male dominated field, and so I am a woman, but I I've worked hard to try to fit into the boys group, for example, and that also just added levels of complexities of who am I, a very, I don't know, I guess fundamental question. And then for me, because, and I think it's because of language, that I spoke different languages, I felt like almost different people in different languages, and so I knew there was this flexibility to who I can be, which made it even more complex, because then I thought, okay, so is it something I'm born with, who I am, my identity? Is it something I take on? Is it something I can mold myself into if I really wanted to? And that's when the rabbit hole was too deep and I needed to come out. I don't know if you had
Yeah.
a different version,
Uh,
similar version of this, but it was getting too much and I just needed to say, okay, I'm not going to figure this out today. Let's pull back.
it's interesting to hear you mention language because I speak only English. Like I can muddle my way through like what my name is and I love you and where's the bathroom? And that's it.
The survival
But
phrases.
yeah. Um, but I was very much aware that language does shape what
Mhm.
we think is possible, what we can talk about, because my parents spoke to me in like this collection of languages that often didn't have a translation to like English words. My mom would try, but there's something also about how like language sounds that like evokes some kind of really core sort of emotional reaction. Um, that like, you know, I don't know, the phrases that they used while they were angry like clearly sounded a certain way, and the phrases that they used while they were just talking about everyday things had like kind of a different kind of delivery. And just yeah, I can see why language would have just like made everything infinitely more complicated. I know, like, speaking of rabbit holes, I really enjoy Haruki Murakami's work, but the caveat is actually I enjoy Jay Rubin as a translator of Murakami's work. And so I'm often left wondering, like, is that actually Murakami that I like, or is it the translator? Because I am literally only getting one person's interpretation of a language that I don't have access to. Um, so it is, yes, infinitely more complicated when you have multiple languages on top of multiple cultural identities, on top of like, I think you mentioned you've lived in Canada and you've also lived in Japan. And have you lived in other places as well?
Yeah, I've lived in Australia and France, and a little bit and back and forth in China as well. And I really felt like I was a different person uh, in each of these different places. I yeah, I don't know. I cut you off.
No, I'm kind of, I find myself wondering if it is just that desire to fit in that we try to like mold ourselves into something that like fits in what we with what we perceive like the sort of people to be like. I know that like my parents in talking about moving to America, they absolutely were trying to fit in. So they were noticing things about what their American colleagues did, in terms of how they raised their children or how they talked about their children, and their accomplishments. And they were constantly referencing like them as a measure of whether or not we were fitting in. And in some cases, they were like, actually, we don't think that's right, so we're going to do something else. But there was a lot of like, they were willing to let me not learn Chinese because they saw the value of me coaching their English. Like their English ended up being pretty good, better than um, most of the other like immigrants that I've ever met. But that, of course, like had a different set of implications.
Do you ever feel like there is something, a wall of sorts between you and your parents when they use English versus how you use English, for example, or how they try to talk to you in Hakka and other languages, and you not being able to respond in that like same way?
Hmm. I sort of, I guess I don't, because for the longest time I've only really had English. Like my my command of like Mandarin and Hakka is so rudimentary. Like there's no chance of me having like a conversation with them when it comes to that. But I do notice that sometimes they fall back on Mandarin and or Hakka if they can't find the English word.
Mhm.
And often I will still know what that means. So they still have kind of that mix, especially now that they're retired and they largely just spend time with each other. um, but I never felt like I had any need to try to respond in any other language because I don't have another language.
And their English is
But
good, so you don't
yeah,
have to somehow.
it is fascinating to hear you talking about this. I'm reminded of when my husband was learning to speed read.
Brain itself notices the pattern a lot earlier than when you consciously see the pattern.
It's interesting that you mention wanting haters and wanting disagreement.